Welcome to Beyond Church Walls. I am your host, Brad Crow. Around here, we discuss various topics from a biblical perspective and the perspective of Christ followers. Thank you for joining today, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome back to the podcast. Have you ever started telling a story and someone chimes in with a good old, "That's not what happened"? Maybe you misremembered, maybe you were embellishing the story, or maybe you were just lying. Today, I'm going to discuss the Gospel of Mark and the significance of it being written so early. I mentioned during the last episode that our church was about to start a journey through the Gospel of Mark. And as I got into this study, I was a little disappointed that there was no mention of how this gospel came to be or the significance of knowing some of these things. In the defense of this study, it was really not the intention of the study to dive into the background of Mark. But at one point in time, the Gospels were thought they were written much later than what they were. Today, it's largely agreed upon that the Gospel of Mark was recorded about 40 AD. And the significance of that was most people have the death of Jesus around 30 to 33 AD. So within about 7 to 10 years after the death of Jesus, we would have had the Gospel of Mark. And the significance of that is really, as time goes on, you tend to forget things. The story is not as fresh. And so the likelihood of forgetting things, is possible. So the fact that we now know that the Gospel of Mark was in the hands of the early church within 7 to 10 years after the death of Jesus is very significant. A family friend had given me some deer meat, and I really like to use deer meat in chili. And I was thinking of some different things that I could do with this deer meat. And another thing that we used to do was make deer sausage. Growing up, my grandpa would always kill a deer or two, and he would make summer sausage, and he would use deer meat and pork, and he had a recipe that he would make. And I can remember at Thanksgiving, Christmas, sitting around with tubes of summer sausage and cheese and crackers. And it was just like every year around that time, you were eating deer sausage, and it was just some of the best stuff ever. My brother, in his teens, maybe early 20s, had decided that he wanted to learn how to make it. And so he had went and helped Grandpa as he made a batch, saw how Grandpa cut everything up and the recipe and all that. Then Josh also had a copy of that recipe. And I had reached out to Josh around Christmas and said that I would like to have a copy of that recipe. And Josh informed me that I already had a copy of that recipe. And I said, "No, you remember that you had helped Grandpa and you had the recipe and all this." And he said, "Yeah, but if you remember, after Grandpa had passed away, Grandma had recorded this recipe for all of us and had given it to us because she wanted us all to have it." And I had totally forgot about that until he had reminded me. So we're talking about something that happened a few years back, but I just couldn't remember it until he mentioned it to me. And I'm like, yes, I definitely remember that now. But at the time, I had just misremembered. I just couldn't remember. Also, there's been times where I have embellished a story as I am telling a story, and Kelsey's always the one that'll chime in and say, "That's not what happened." When I'm telling this story and Kelsey's there and "That's not what happened." Kelsey knows because she was there. The Gospel of Mark was in the hands of people that had seen the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. They had seen the miracles. They had seen the multitudes fed. Maybe they were part of a miracle. Maybe they were part of being fed. Maybe they were the one that the demon had been cast out. Maybe they were the one with the issue of blood. And so they have firsthand knowledge of these things taking place. If these things didn't happen, they would have never been accepted by the early church. They would have never been in their hands because they would have known them not to be true. So the fact that we know that the Gospel of Mark was recorded so early that it would have been in the hands of the early church and accepted by the early church. So that means it was accepted by the very people that had seen the miracles, the very people that had listened to the teachings of Jesus, that had seen him crucified and that had seen him resurrected. It was accepted by those people. And so for you and I, that is very significant that we have the Gospel of Mark. Most people believe that Mark was used
as an outline for Matthew and Luke. We have Hebrews. We have these things in the first century. And a lot of people will discuss the lost books of the Bible, or they want to discuss certain books and why they weren't included in the Bible. And first of all, let me say that the Gospels that you and I have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there were no names attached to these Gospels. So they were written anonymously. Some might ask, why would they do this? It's largely believed they did this because they really saw no need to. They had a message they wanted and needed to deliver, and there was no need to establish their authority. You had seen the miracles, you were part of his teachings, and you have this message. You see him crucified, you see a resurrected Jesus. You want to get this message out to others. And so there's really no significance of attaching your name to it. You just want to get the message out, and you just want to record the things that took place so that others can have it. Think about how blessed we are and how thankful we are that they did record these so that you and I could read them today and that we could have them in our hands. And the Gospels were written anonymously along with Hebrews, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. In the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century and on, you started to get other books. I'm using a guideline put out by Wesley Huff. If you go to wesleyhuff.com, he has some different things out there and some different illustrations that you can look at. But in the 2nd century, we started to get the gospel of truth. We started to get the gospel of the Egyptians. 2nd century, maybe 3rd century, we started to get the gospel of Thomas, the gospel of Mary, the gospel of Peter. Around the 3rd century, 4th century, we started to get the gospel of Judas. You get the gospel of Philip in the 4th century. 5th century and on, you start to get the secret gospel of Mark, and you start to get all these different things coming out. The gospel of Barnabas was 5th century and on. And so you start to get all these different books. I'll just read this directly from what Wesley Huff has recorded. He says, non-canonical gospels, due to their late date of composition, disqualify themselves as accurate gospel accounts if for no other reason than the names attached to their authorship. So like Peter, Thomas, Judas, etc. They were already deceased when these letters were written. In some cases, the names they would have attached to these, such as Peter, Thomas, and Judas, they would have been deceased for centuries prior to the composition of these documents. And it's very significant that they tried to attach names such as the Gospel of Mary. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar. He claims to be agnostic, leaning towards atheist. And he writes, these were recorded and a name attached to them, such as Peter, Mary, Judas, Barnabas, because they wanted these letters to seem more significant than the Gospels that we already had from the early church. You can see the difference between the early writers, where they didn't want to attach a name because they didn't want it to be about them. They wanted it to be about Christ and what he had done. And then in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, and on, you start to see these false books and these false teachings where they're attaching names of significance so that more people will maybe find them and believe these writings that dispute or contradict the Gospels. As far as the Gospels and not having their names attached to them, really, to me, aligns with Matthew 6. And I'm reading the New Living Translation, but verse number 1, he says, watch out. He's talking about giving to the needy, but he says, watch out, don't do your good deeds publicly to be admired by others, for you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to someone in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I tell you the truth, they have received all the reward they will ever get. And so I do understand that Jesus is teaching about giving to the needy. They were giving to the needy and they were sounding the trumpets. They were, look at me. It was about them and what they had done. Where the early writers, it wasn't about them and what they had done or what they were recording. It was all about what Jesus had done. And so I think about YouTube, and you have Instagram, and you have TikTok, and you have everybody trying to go viral. I see a lot of videos where people will go up to somebody that has a glaring need and I want to bless you with so much money. I want to bless you with a new phone. I want to bless you with a new car, whatever. And these people, obviously, they're in need. They need this item. They need this money, whatever it is. And so they're obviously moved, and it's such a touching thing. But the truth is they're doing the very things that Jesus is teaching us not to do. These Instagram people, YouTube people, what they're doing is they're trying to create a viral video that will have millions of followers and that they can get fame on earth. Jesus is telling us, he says, that's the reward you're going to get. He says, but when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you. And so I don't know. I just thought that was somewhat significant. They were trying to leave something for the next generations that they could hold on to, and that we could have the same beliefs that the early church had. And as you're reading your Bible, I think it's important, like I said, to really know what we have and what we possess. I had mentioned wesleyhuff.com, and there's so many other things out there that you and I can grab onto. So much good information out there, and there's so much evidence for what we have today. At one time, the Gospels were thought to have been written much later. It's encouraging to me to know that what we have is really early. It encourages me to know that the Mark that I sit down and read is the same letter that was in the hands of the early church. That's amazing. It's amazing. I know there's so much that people like to put out, but the truth is, what you and I have and what you and I possess when we read our Bibles is absolutely amazing. I wanted to share this with you today in hopes that if anybody ever tried to lead you astray and tell you that the Gospels that we have were written long after Jesus and his followers had died off, that you can say, most Bible scholars date Mark to be around 40 AD, and Jesus would have died around 30 to 33 AD. So the Gospel of Mark would have been in the hands of the early church within about 7 years after Jesus' death. We need to know these things. We need to hold on to these things. There's so much information being thrown out that is just false. There's so many things being taught as factual, and people talk with such charisma and they talk with such a matter of fact. They're really good talkers, but so many people don't know what they're talking about. And so be very careful what you hang on to. Be very careful what you let go in. Be prepared to give a defense. You need to know why you know what you know. And that is one thing that as I keep going through this podcast, you're going to hear from me time and time again. You have to know why you believe what you believe. We live among so many differing opinions. We work with people from all walks of life. We encounter people from all walks of life. You have to know why you believe what you believe, and you have to be prepared to share that belief with others. If you think back to the change that Jesus made in your life, if you think back to how every aspect of your life changed, if you think back to the hope and the peace that you received when you accepted Christ as your Savior, that is what we want to share with others. When you know what you believe, it is so much easier to share the gospel because you're prepared to defend whatever they throw your way. I'll leave you with this today. Know what you believe and know why you believe it. I continue to put out these episodes because people like you are taking the time to listen. And so thank you so much. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you on the next podcast.